Welcome to Healing Rain. I'm Sue Detweiler, your host, and my goal is to help you live with more passion, love with more purpose, and lead an overcoming life. Well, one of the ways that we lead an overcoming life is listening to the one who created us. He's so creative, and he created you with a purpose. And today we're going to focus on those of you who may feel called to media, entertainment, arts, music. Maybe you're a writer, you're a speaker, maybe you're called to television, maybe you're called to podcasting. If you have a message to share and you want to be relevant in today's culture, you're going to get a lot out of this interview. Today, I am replaying an interview I did with Phil Cooke in 2021 for the National Religious Broadcasters. He works at the intersection of faith, media, and culture. He's a working producer in Hollywood, and yet he also has a Ph.D. in theology. His client list includes studios and networks like Walt Disney, DreamWorks, USA Network, as well as major Christian organizations such as Joel Osteen, Joyce Meyer, the Museum of the Bible, many, many more. He's produced TV and film programming in over 60 countries. And in the process, he's been shot at, he survived 2 military coups, fallen out of a helicopter, and been threatened in prison. I just want you to know, as someone that travels to the nations, Phil and Kathleen Cooke are the real deal. I'm really happy to have Phil Cooke on today. And Phil, you have such a breadth of experience. And I love the fact that you really started in film and camera work on Oral Roberts University campus.
Yeah.
So, wow, what was that like filming Oral Roberts and the healing meetings that he did and television that Oral did?
Yeah, that was back in the early 70s. And I was a student at ORU. And my sophomore year, a friend of mine said, "Hey, I'm working on the television crew for Oral, and we need an extra guy to help move sets around." And so I got on as a very lowly grunt. I was just moving set pieces. And then I graduated up to lights and setting lights. And then I started running camera. And really, before it was over, I ended up directing the programs for a number of years. And in fact, after I graduated in 76, I came to LA for a year. And back then, I was a freelancer and the unions had control of everything. It was really tough to get in as an independent person into Hollywood. And so I was getting married and I knew I needed a real job. And so they asked me if I'd come back and work on Oral's television program. So I did. I came back and came on as an assistant director, eventually started directing and producing the program. So I was there for a number of years, and it was one of the great times of my life. I can't express just how much I learned from Oral because he was such a legend. I think one of the greatest preachers of certainly that generation. And I just had a really terrific time. And most of the principles I know today that I use in media, I learned from Oral. So it was a great experience.
Well, I know that I personally was impacted by Oral, by reading his biography, and there's something about pioneers, and Oral was a pioneer. He was a
Yeah.
pioneer in the healing ministry, but he was also a pioneer in broadcast. And as a Foursquare pastor, some of my background is Sister Amy McPherson, who,
Yeah.
she began some of the first broadcasting in LA and,
Yeah.
saw it reach in and make a difference in culture.
Well,
Uh,
it's interesting because Rex Humbard was the guy that talked Oral into going on television. Oral was doing these big tent crusades all over the country, and he had he was the first person to build a tent that seated 10,000 people, and he was so successful. Rex said, "Hey, you need to put this on television," and so he actually came to Hollywood, met with NBC, and in those days, commercial advertisers had a huge amount of influence on the television programs they would do. And so NBC said, yeah, let's do this, but we need to put, I think it was Bayer aspirin and maybe Gillette razors or Alcoa aluminum. There was 3 or 4 companies that were going to do commercials. And in those days, commercial sponsors could edit your show. They could decide what you preached on. They could have a lot of input into the show. It's not true now, but back in those days, they had a lot of power. And Oral said, well, I preach the gospel. I can't have a razor blade company or a Holiday Inn tell me what I can and can't preach. So he went back to Tulsa, and the thought occurred to him, well, what if I raised the money and did this myself? And so he went back to NBC and said, what if I paid for it? And we didn't have any sponsors. And literally, that's what we call paid time broadcasting. And it was born that day when Oral came up with that idea to do it out here in NBC. And so since then, the whole premise of Christian television all over the world has largely been paid time, where you raise the money to put your show on the air. And so he changed the direction of Christian television forever. And there was good things about it and some things that haven't worked out so well about it. But he was totally a pioneer in everything that he did.
Yeah, and you got to see some of the miracles that happened at the events. What was that like? Talk about the presence of God in the midst of those meetings and filming.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oral was totally legit. There was a lot of controversy about him later in his life because of financial pressures and some things, but I think he was the real thing. And one of the things I got to do was I found a trove of old films, 16 millimeter films that had been made of his old crusades. And back then he had the healing line, and people would fill out cards and they go through the line, and I actually found in storage at the university, they had just stashed it somewhere. And I found in storage where all those cards were, the films of his crusade. And so I started going through them and finding people who were healed in the 30s, 40s, 50s, were still alive. This would be back in the late 70s, early 80s. Were still alive. And I called him up and I said, hey, I'd like to bring a film crew out and shoot an interview with you, see if the healing still exists. I mean, are you still healed? Did it work? Was it legit? And we called it Miracles on the Road. And I traveled all over the country interviewing people 10, 20, 30 years after they'd originally gone through that healing line with Oral, and interviewing them. Like in one case, a guy came to one of Oral's meetings, I think it was in the late 40s, and he had fallen or had been in a car accident, and he had broken his back, paralyzed from the chest down, horrible shape. They brought him in on a hospital bed or a gurney, and Oral prayed. The guy was healed. And 20 years later, I videotaped him roofing houses. He roofed houses for a living, and he would carry up giant slats of shingles in his hands, going up a ladder and roofing houses. So it stuck. Apparently that healing really worked. And there was so many cases like that where people had been healed and it had stayed with them for a long time, and it dramatically changed their life. So that was one of the most interesting things I've ever done.
Well, and Phil, those are my favorite things. I just want you to know, because I've been a researcher of revival and healing.
Mm-hmm.
It's been one of the things that I've researched, and my favorite things are those original stories, and then the joy that Jesus really does heal body, mind, soul, and spirit. And
absolutely,
and experiencing that, and really, I have a grandpa that was healed supernaturally. He was a Mennonite guy. He drove a Surrey, one of those Surreys, those open buggies. And he ended up falling off a bridge into a creek bed, and the horse fell on top of him, and he was laying there near death. And as he's laying there, he's praying, God, first of all, it's a gravel road. Somebody find me. So the first miracle was the road grader who turned around, went back, got out and looked out and found him. Second miracle was that, he lived. They got him to the hospital. And then these Mennonites asked for the elders to come in and anoint him with oil, and he was healed. And then they said, well, he'll never walk. And then he walked. Well, I want you to know my grandpa and my grandma were completely changed. And then
Wow.
they were impacted by what you were doing. So I grew up with Oral Roberts and I grew up with Catherine Coleman, and my Mennonite grandparents, and they would stay up all night long praying. And they ended up changing the course of my life and the trajectory of my life. But I knew from a very young girl that healing was real.
Yeah.
And I love it that these things and what you're doing is making such a difference in the lives of people.
Well, the impact Oral had on me, and well, there's a lot of impact Oral had on me, but one of the big things was his understanding that media was a powerful tool. Paul launched the early church with the technology of his time, which was letters. And he coupled letters with the Roman roads and got the word out in a very powerful way. And Martin Luther in the 1500s, he completely changed the publishing industry through books. He wanted to get the gospel out in that way. And I just am fascinated studying through history and how people have embraced the media. And early on, back in probably from about 1898 to 1914, the church produced more movies than Hollywood did. I've done some interesting research that indicated the church was just really at the forefront of movie making. I worked with a church in Montclair, New Jersey, right across the river from New York City, and they had a historic cathedral that was built there in Montclair in about 1911, maybe 1908, somewhere in that time. And they were doing a renovation of the sanctuary, and they knocked out a back wall and discovered a huge 35 millimeter movie projector in the wall. And they did some research and discovered that back in the teens and the 20s and the 30s, they would have movie night on Saturday nights, and people would come in from the community and they would show films. And they were Christian movies. And years later, they decided to move away from that. And it was so difficult to take the projector out. They just boarded it up in the wall and people forgot it existed. So over and over, I continue to find situations where Christians 50, 75, 100 years ago were using film and television in so many unique ways. And I think Oral was a real pioneer of that. And I grew up learning his philosophy about using television. And I've been all over the world filming him doing things. And it's just been an amazing, amazing opportunity.
Well, I read that you've been in 60 countries.
Yeah.
Your bio said, and I love the fact that it sounds like you were in a helicopter and almost, talk about some of those things. You were in prison because of filming overseas.
Well, we've been, the problem with Christian ministry organizations is they're working in very difficult places. And so if we're going to go film and tell their story, we have to get into some pretty risky situations. And the helicopter situation was actually an Oral Roberts story. He was filming a crusade in Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica. And I went down to shoot it. He was doing a crusade down there in the National Stadium, big open air National Stadium. And I went down to film it. And about halfway through the day before that evening service started, I realized this thing's going to be full. And the coolest shot would be an aerial shot. But there was no drones back in those days. It was all helicopters. But the problem was there was no helicopter on the island of Jamaica that was outfitted to shoot film. And I realized that the Red Stripe Beer Company had a Bell Jet Ranger, a great helicopter. And so I raced across the island and actually talked them into letting me borrow it for an hour. And we took the door off and I sat on the side, hanging out with my big old camera. And the pilot tied a rope around my waist to tie me into the helicopter. But neither one of us noticed there was a few loops in that rope. And so when we took off and he turned to go out over Kingston Bay, I just slid right out. And I'm dangling out there by the rope. And fortunately, he saw it and whipped the helicopter back and jerked me back in. And let me tell you, I tied that rope quick. And when you're dangling from a helicopter, there are two things to think of. You always think about. One is you get right with God pretty quick. And the second thing is make sure the shot is in focus. So it was one of those horrifying experiences, but we got an amazing shot of the crusade. We used it on television and it was just really, really something interesting.
Wow. I love what God has done in your life. And you've always been at that juncture of media and culture and theology. Yeah. And one of the things that is a real struggle is, and I find myself, I have a love-hate relationship with media and
Yeah.
social media,
Oh, yeah.
because there are things about it that really, the cult of celebrity, is really an ungodly thing. To be puffed up
Totally.
or arrogant or proud or try to, selfish ambition, that's an evil thing.
True.
And so how do you walk into this ministry that we have with a purity of heart? And how have you walked through that mix, because you've been in this for years now?
Sure. Well, I think God has seen fit to surround me with people who think I'm an idiot. So that keeps the ego in check. From my wife to our team here at Cooke Media Group, our production company, I think I'm on pretty safe ground there. But you're right. The media is a love-hate relationship. I think social media is a huge factor in the polarization we have in our culture today. The fact that we're so disorganized and not unified like we used to be. I just think social media is a real culprit. There's a documentary on Netflix right now. If someone's watching this or listening to this episode, there's a wonderful documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, where it really talks about what makes social media work and why it does what it does and what drives it. It's really it'll really open your eyes. And yet at the same time, social media is a powerful tool for getting your message out. I wish more Christians embraced it and could use it in a positive way. So it is a love-hate relationship, no question. I've spent my whole career working in the media and advising some of the largest churches and ministry organizations in America on how to use media effectively. And I still have to be careful. I'll still get lost scrolling around on Instagram and Facebook and just seeing what other people are doing. And the amount of time we waste doing that is phenomenal. So I have to be really careful and how much time I spend there. It can be a huge waste, but at the same time, if we're using it effectively, and I wish more Christians would share their faith on social media.
Yes.
I think that's a big issue too. I think we could have a much greater impact if we simply did things like that. So there are ways I think that we can use it in a real positive way, but at the same time, we should be concerned about the negative aspects as well.
Yes. And there's also a real shift in terms of how media is used. I mean, I think I've seen media for years that the big deal was that it be well produced. And there's been a shift from that.
Yeah, true.
Because part of what's happened is people have seen the ingenuineness of, something being so produced, and yet if there's not the integrity of heart, and I don't know, you probably don't know this, but I have been a Foursquare pastor for years and years. We were senior pastoring, and recently we have been repositioned and become a part of Upper Room Network. Now, or a global movement. And you may know about it from your kids who watch it on YouTube because of the music.
Right.
And one of the things that movement has done, and by the way, it's all 20 somethings, it's 20 somethings that are getting saved. So it's Gen Z and millennial. And part of what their goal is, they didn't use media for years. And then they saw a picture in their minds of an IV, somebody that was sick with an IV, and the IV went to YouTube. And so they made a concerted effort. Okay, we're going to get in there, but we're not going to make it look like it's better than it is. We're going to make it as, real and graphic, who we are. And, their YouTube videos went viral, and then God began to use them where it's, what it's like going to church, Phil. You're standing in line for an hour. If you're coming to visit, to get in and get a seat, and then it's a long, long service. So it goes against all those principles of being, seeker sensitive. And so it's been a real shift for me, but I see God at work in this group of people, and it's been helpful for me as, someone that's much older, just to see how media can be used to impact lives.
True.
And so anyway, that was a long introduction to my question. My question is, what are the shifts? Because what used to be relevant in media is no longer relative. What used to work is not working. So what
Right.
are some of the shifts for churches and ministries?
Well, you're exactly right. Online, authenticity is much more powerful than quality right now because people are used to seeing, poorly lit videos and, poorly shot videos. They're kind of used to it. It used to be a little different world, and quality was the thing we really pushed to distinguish ourselves. And I still push for quality whenever we can. But at the same time, I'm pastors, for instance, during the COVID shutdown, when churches were having to shift to live streaming their services. I told some pastors, don't make your live stream so perfect that it looks like a television show. It still needs to be a little rough around the edges because people are used to seeing that online. So I think that being real is much more important than being particularly good as far as production quality and lighting and things like that is so important. The other thing that you mentioned about YouTube is interesting. Short videos have become the number one marketing tool in America. In fact, right now, more internet bandwidth is taken up from short videos than anything other than Amazon Prime and Netflix. Every companies, hospitals, nonprofits, churches are all using short videos to tell their story. And I'm talking 3 to 6 minute videos for the most part. One of our clients is the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And we've been a part of that since groundbreaking. And we produce literally hundreds and hundreds of short videos on marketing, awareness, fundraising, all kinds of things, membership, all kinds of things to tell the story of the museum in 3 to 6 minute little short segments. So those short videos, churches, if they're, it's funny. Churches think, well, maybe I don't have the equipment I need, or I don't have a studio. Well, there are 2 film festivals in America right now for feature films produced on iPhones. So
Really?
Don't think you don't have,
Wow.
if you've got a camera or an iPhone in your pocket, you've got a studio available to you. So now you can go out and shoot with your phone. A lot of churches that I work with were shooting their live streams on a phone during the shutdown. So there's so many more things we can do now. Back in those days when I was working with Oral, just the lens of a camera cost $150,000, not to mention the cost of the camera itself. So those things have changed dramatically. In fact, when I left ORU and started our company, Cooke Media Group, a lot of churches and ministry organizations would hire us to bring in the equipment and shoot the whole thing because it was so expensive for them to purchase. But now so many churches and ministry organizations have their own video equipment. We do just as much consulting and advising those guys as we do producing it ourselves. So the world has shifted dramatically. And I think the interesting thing to me is a lot of churches, kind of went cold turkey during the shutdown, going to a live stream. So many pastors I knew would say things like, well, I don't mind live streaming my service, but that's not real ministry. Well, let me tell you, they changed their tune during the church lockdown.
Yeah.
And, being able to accept donations online was critical. Being able to capture the service online was critical. Pastors have really understood now how the digital media works. Part of the reason I wrote my book, Maximize Your Influence, is to be a reference book for those kind of pastors who have questions about how to engage the culture in this digital age we live in. So we've just seen so much. And in fact, some churches did such a great job. I must say this, that I had one pastor in Alabama text me and said, I pastor an African-American congregation of about 900 people. He's an old friend of mine. And he said, since the shutdown, he said, we're averaging, he said, I normally preach to 900 people on Sunday, but since the shutdown, I'm averaging 30 to 40,000 people a week watching our live stream. And he said, 1.5 million people have seen my Easter message online. He said, I feel guilty saying this because I'm a pastor, but the truth is, I really have no desire to go back to the building. He said, we're making such a great impact in our area online. I just think it's incredible. So we're just seeing that some people that have embraced it have really done well. Other churches that fought it have really struggled. So I just think that we're not going back. We'll go back to the physical building, but we need to keep our foot on the gas when it comes to using live stream, using short videos, using media, podcasting. These kind of things are going to be critical for the future.
Yeah, I've been really encouraged, in my love-hate relationship with what God is doing with media. Some friends of mine, you may want to look this up on TikTok. Some friends of mine lead One Voice, and
Okay.
their focus prior to COVID was they would go into schools and they would reach high school kids. Well,
Okay.
then when COVID happened, they completely shifted and they broadcast every day now, and they're on TikTok, and they've literally
Ah,
led people to Jesus. They've baptized online. I mean, I've kind of watched some of this, and they are equipping a new generation, but they're running. I mean, I don't have the figures, but I think it's like 4 million type of
wow.
followers. So, I mean, they are
Yeah.
making a difference, and their calling is to be evangelist. And that's where Gen Z is. They're familiar with TikTok. And so, I mean, I
Yeah.
tell you, I need to start TikTok, and I'm going to, even though I'm like, oh my goodness, help my brain wrap around
Yeah.
all these different things, because God wants to help lives, and God wants to heal people, and He's going to use it. Yeah.
That's true. And we can't be experts at everything. I don't do TikTok. I've got an account there. I'm on, I check it out occasionally, but I really focus on my blog at philcooke.com for one thing. And then I share that through my Instagram, my Twitter, my Facebook. But I've realized that I can't, if I'm going to do everything, I'm not going to have time to do anything important. And so that's one of the things that I think is so distracting about social media. Sometimes that we pour so much time into doing that, we don't really accomplish what God put us on the earth to do. So
I agree.
I think it's great to use it to tell your story and get the word out there. But my goal, I was just talking to our web guy today, that my legacy is going to be my blog, not my posts on Facebook or my posts on Twitter or Instagram. And so ultimately, I want to drive people there. And so that's how I use social media primarily. So a lot of it is understanding, what did God put us here to do? What are we called to accomplish with our lives? And sometimes we have to say no to some really good things in order to say yes to some great things. And we just can't get so distracted and so pulled in so many different directions that we don't actually accomplish something that we want to be remembered for. And I think that's an important thing to remember in this distracted world we live in.
I totally agree. We've got to understand the no's in order to grab the yes. And which things are we called to interact with, and which ones are we not? And that's going to be an individual conversation with Jesus.
True. Oh,
On
boy,
a
that's
personal
true.
level, but also, even churches where they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And just understanding, my heart is beginning to break for the Gen Z generation. And partly because they have grown up online, and, this fatherless orphan generation that, they need Jesus just like the
Yeah.
millennials did, just like Gen X did, just like baby busters and baby boomers. You look at all
Yeah.
these generations, that we all need Jesus. And so, what have you found in terms of sharing the gospel? And we're talking about length of
Sure.
time, to be consistent principles, because the technology is going to change.
Yeah.
The latest gadget's going to change. But what are some of the principles about, like, for example, we talked about authenticity.
Sure.
What are some of those types of principles that we should think about in the media?
Well, first of all, you're exactly right about changing. I tell people when I speak at a lot of pastors' conferences and events like that. And I always tell pastors that, the Bible says God's word never changes, but trust me, everything else does. People change, technology changes, culture changes, styles, trends, all that changes. So it's telling the story is one thing, but understanding the way people receive it is something else. And so we do have to stay on top of those kind of changes that are happening out there in the culture. But the overarching principles, like you talked about, storytelling is a great example. We've been telling stories since the days of Hebrew storytellers sitting in the desert around a campfire in the Middle East 10,000 years ago. And stories have always been remarkably compelling. If you look at television ratings, the number one most watched TV programs are story-driven programs. And so there's something that we're wired. There's something about the way we're wired that stories are a powerful, powerful, compelling thing. If you tell a story well, you can, it's not about lecturing somebody. It's not about preaching to somebody. It's almost like you're sliding the knife into their back without realizing it. When you're telling a great story, you're giving them an eternal principle, but they don't really realize it because they're so caught up in this story. And stories in many ways are like, a ticking bomb that when you tell them a story, they may not totally get it at that moment, but maybe an hour, a day, a week later, that bomb will go off and they'll suddenly realize, oh, I get the point now. I understand it. And so you see why epic stories, Star Wars and movie theaters, those kind of films, the Marvel pictures that are so popular today are just epic examples of great storytelling. And I think one of the things that we need to remind ourselves of in the church is the power of stories. That is so critical. I know pastors that I just don't think they're just not, they just have no gift of storytelling at all. And their sermons are dry and boring and dead. Whereas Jesus, pretty much, that's all he ever did. I mean, Jesus didn't write a book about church leadership. He didn't write a book about theology. He didn't write the 10 principles of launching a new congregation. He just told stories. And very often, it was funny. Very often he wouldn't even explain them. He would just tell the story and then move on. Sometimes his apostles were so dense, his disciples were so dense, he'd tell them kind of behind the scenes what the story meant. But very often he was willing to risk. And this is what I find interesting about Jesus. He was willing, he only had 3 years of adult ministry. He knew this. He was God. And yet he was willing to risk those 3 years of the power of telling compelling stories. Like I say, he didn't leave a curriculum. He didn't leave a program. He didn't leave some kind of a outreach model. He just told stories. And yet those stories changed the world. So I think if we could understand the power of compelling stories and how much they matter, I think Christians could embrace the film world, the television world, the podcasting world, the social media world in a much more powerful and compelling way. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, I think it is too, Phil. And I think about it that right now, presently, the non-Christian films are carrying a lot of theology in their storytelling.
Yeah. True.
And so the theology is coming through. It's one of the things that the fact that you have a Ph.D. in theology, I absolutely love, because it's one of those things that people tend to hate theology, but how we think about God's so important. And I taught theology for a decade. And one of the things that I'd say to songwriters or, writers or pastors in training, the reality is if you don't understand that, then you're going to miss. Because when Jesus was telling the story, he had perfect theology.
Oh, yeah.
Jesus is perfect theology. And so that came through in his illustrations because we were learning about God, through his stories. And so,
that's
again,
right. Let me give you an example of that, which is really good. A few years ago, I produced a film for theaters called the Hillsong movie, Let Hope Rise. It was based on Hillsong United, the world's most popular worship band at the time. And we covered their world tour and leading up to the release of a new album. And one of the things we discovered is we had a massive film crew on location. We had, a ton of people filming and working on the project. But even as we're setting up for a concert and the concert's beginning, and if they wanted to debut a new song, they would have to call Sydney back to Mothership Church, Hillsong Church, and talk to the theology guys, the pastoral staff, to make sure the lyrics lined up theologically in a correct way. And they would not perform the song if they didn't get the sign off from the guys back at the church. And I was frustrated because I'm trying to, the concert's happening, guys, we need to get out there. But they were so good about that. They would not go out and sing a new song until they had the sign off from the pastoral staff at the church that it was theologically legit and correct. And so I had such great admiration for that. I wish more artists would go to that kind of effort. So often in Christian worship music and in movies and books and other things, the theology is really, really kind of suspect. And I wish we'd go to a little more effort to make sure what the Bible says is reflected accurately in the work that we do. So I think you're exactly right.
Well, I knew we would like each other. I knew that aspect would come through. Even you haven't mentioned artwork, but
Mhm.
in teaching my children and
Yeah.
finding good children's Bibles, and sometimes the illustrations are wrong
Yeah.
theologically. Or
Oh,
they're
yeah.
not accurate. So all of those things come to bear. My children grew up with me teaching the Bible,
Yes.
and correcting the inaccuracies, that would come up. They grew up with me talking back to films on TV that that lies were coming through. So I mean, it's one of those things, and I want to, just as we come towards closing,
Sure.
I want to circle back around to the topic of purity. To the topic of, because let's face it, we've been around long enough. We can see so many people that began with such earnest faith and, self-sacrifice, and things happen, and suffering happens, and betrayal
Yeah.
happens, and, all of those different things. And you can end up just relying on production, and you miss the heart of God, you miss the presence of God, you miss the purity of God, the power that comes through when heaven comes to earth, and you are just capturing it on film.
Right.
And so what have you seen? Because I'm sure you've seen it all, Phil. I'm really, you've seen all different. So, but what is it, when heaven and earth meet, so to speak, in media, when you know that you have God's presence and power in the midst of the technological world?
Well, I think that the thing that I try to convey to churches about that is, first of all, technology doesn't drive everything, and we shouldn't allow it to drive everything. So often I'll go to a church that's trying to do television, or they're trying to do video or other kinds of media out there, and there's a tech guy or an engineering guy that's in charge of everything. And I love my tech friends and I love my engineering friends, and they're vital to the process. But they're not the producers. They're not the person who's thinking, okay, how are we capturing the pastor's message? How are we capturing the way the Holy Spirit is moving here? Technology should serve at the hand of the message. It's so important to understand that. Some churches will tell a pastor, okay, here's where we put the cameras, so you need to preach here, and you need to walk over here, and you can't walk out of this area. Let me tell you something. Oral Roberts, back in my early days, by the grace of God, he taught me that, hey, I'm going to do what the Lord tells me to do, and it's, if you either capture or you don't, and if you don't have a job. And he was exactly right. I was there to serve him. He wasn't there to serve me. And so pastors need to understand that it's not about having 10 or 12 cameras. It's not about the way the lighting is. It's, what are we doing? I mean, Craig Rochelle at Life Church in Oklahoma City they're the biggest church in America right now. And yet they shoot, and they have 37 campuses that they're feeding with their video, and their live stream is the biggest audience in America. And yet they only have 3 cameras. They shoot him with 3 cameras, and that's it. Whereas I know churches that have 6, 8 cameras and are not doing nearly as good a job of capturing the pastor. So it's really about how we capture that message that counts. And so never, ever let technology drive what you do. The pastor's message, I mean, God called this pastor for a reason, and his message should be the driver of everything we do. I often say that the pastor's message is the point of the spear for everything we do. So often I'll see a church where the pastor preaches on Sunday, and then on Monday, the social media team is telling a completely different story with their social media. The video guys are telling a different story with the video. The website tells a different story. The email blasts that go out tell a different story. Let me tell you, it's like an army going into battle and having all their guns pointed in different directions. That's never going to make an impact at all. The armies that make an impact are the guys that point all their guns in one direction at the enemy, and they blast a hole in the wall. And so churches and ministries need to be the same thing. Whatever that pastor is preaching on Sunday, we should follow up that theme with our social media, with our video, with our web presence, with our email blasts, with our print materials. Everything that follows that up the following week should reflect that theme the pastor is preaching on. I'll tell you, when that happens, man, people start to make an impact. We know, marketing expert Seth Godin says repetition builds trust. People actually love to hear something over and over again, and we all need to hear that. And so churches that can do that are the churches that really make an impact in their community. And it's so important to remember that repetition matters. And, technology serves the pastor. The pastor is not serving the technology.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to preach on that, but
no, I'm really grateful for what you're saying. And I've seen it at work. And, I think when a church is a 20-something church or a 30-something church, it's often easier for that group of people to navigate because, they're current with the technology and with telling the story. And literally what I'm seeing is people are making choices to move to Dallas and live here based on the live stream that they're seeing of Upper Room. And that is like significant. So you think about it's not so much about the technology for Christians, even though that's really important. And if you miss that, you're going to miss the message. You're going to butcher it. But it's really about the message. It's really about Jesus and telling his story in a way that reaches the people without compromise, I think.
I agree.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, back in the golden days of filmmaking, film director John Huston said a powerful statement. He said, if, as a director, if you do a shot that's so creative, so interesting that the viewer notices it, he said, you failed because you've distracted them from the story. And I feel the same way about church media, ministry media, that if we're trying to be cool, if we're trying to be super uber creative, and we're so creative and cool that people notice it and it draws attention to itself, we've failed because we've drawn people away from the message we're trying to share. So that's a really critical principle.
I agree. Hey, I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
Have you read Jeremy Riddle's book, The Reset?
I have not, but I will. I'll write it down right now.
Yeah, I listened to it on audio recently.
Okay.
And it's read in his voice, and Jeremy Riddle has had a huge influence as a songwriter and worship leader. He's now at Anaheim Vineyard. But I've listened to it recently, and part of what he's bringing to bear is that our business practices, our ministry practices, when we're in media and we're in the mess of things, somehow you have to keep a pure heart, and part of what's happening is that people have become enamored with becoming Christian celebrities. Like that's the thing that's most important to them. And if you think about that, that's people pleasing. And Jesus never did people pleasing.
Right.
He did the opposite. He was serving the Father. And one of the things that I haven't asked you, but talk about the business of media. Because that part of it, how have you been able as a businessman, because you've been in this all your life, how have you walked the principles of purity in your heart so that, again, the message of Jesus comes through?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think about it very often. It's, overtly like that. I do think that a big part of it is being, you're always thinking about, I don't want to embarrass God. I want to honor God. I don't do something so stupid that I embarrass the Lord. And one of the things I tell young filmmakers when they come to Hollywood is, lead with your talent, not with your faith. Every year here in Hollywood, we get young filmmakers who are Christians who come out and say, they'll go meet with a studio head or a producer and say, God's called me to come and change Hollywood. Well, they get laughed off the property. They get thrown out immediately because they're considered nuts. But if you come out here and you're an amazing writer or an amazing actor or a producer or director, that gets their attention. That's what they respect. And if you get their attention, guess what? They'll listen to anything you have to say. So one of the things I've discovered is show the world you're good at what you do. Being a Christian doesn't give you a free pass to be lousy at what you do. In fact, you ought to be a lot better than anyone else. And so I wrote a blog post recently, or I made a statement on social media that Jesus just, when he was a young carpenter, he and his father, he didn't just make furniture. They made really good furniture, and that was an important issue for them. They made really good furniture. And that's the attitude we should have. That's what gets the world's attention. And once we've gotten their attention, they'll start to listen to anything we have to say. So I think that's really critical. I think one of the things that I've worked hard at is understanding how radically the change is happening in our culture, trying to stay in front of that as much as possible. And so we can help more and more churches, ministry leaders get their story out there in a more powerful way. I also have a wife, Kathleen, who's relentless about, the gospel, and she's not going to let me screw up. She's on me all the time about this kind of stuff. And she co-founded the company. So she's a vital part of everything we do. And I think that's an important issue as well. We travel together whenever we possibly can. And we've worked together for all this time. And so that's made a big difference for us. And so little things like that, I just, would encourage people that very often it's the little thing. It's the things that, allowing your creative team to take credit for stuff. If you do that, they'll walk through fire for you. There's so many ways. One of my passions right now is teaching leaders how to lead creative people. I think one of the things we need to understand in the church more, they did a survey of about 1,000 secular executives, CEOs, a few years ago. And those CEOs said the number one trait, the number one thing executives and leaders need to know now is creativity and how to lead creative people. That's the currency of our culture. And so I think as church leaders and ministry leaders, we need to understand how to inspire and motivate our designers, our video people, our web people, those kind of creative people that really get our message out there in a big way. So I've been doing a lot of teaching lately on how to inspire and lead creative people, because I do believe that's the future. So, I don't know if there's a big overarching way I have kept from screwing up. I've certainly made my share of mistakes. I've had to fire a few clients over the years. We've lost a few clients. I think part of it is I'm just really driven to learn more. I'm always trying to learn. I'm a voracious reader. I just read the new biography of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian and philosopher from the 1800s. And he was just an incredibly passionate about sharing. He lived in a world where they had a church-sanctioned church. Lutheranism was sanctioned by the state.
Right.
But he had a bold passion to tell people, just because you were born into the church and raised in the church doesn't mean you're a Christian. And so I just have that kind of passion out there to let people know that Christianity, we need to take another look at that. Our culture is moving away from it. It's being marginalized. But I just think all of us as believers need to do a better job.
Yeah.
I'll shut up. But one thing I would say is, in one of our books, The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How We Get It Back, in that book, I did some research that indicated it's staggering how few Christians will ever share their faith with a single person during their entire lifetime.
Wow.
And that's so incredibly sad. And so I just would encourage people listening or watching today, be more bold about your faith. Doesn't mean you have to be a jerk. It doesn't mean you have to be pushy, but stop being so afraid to open up and just share what God's done in your life. I think that alone can make such a big difference to the friends around you.
I think so too. And really, when you keep anchored to the Bible, everything you're saying is in the Bible. So
True.
Phil, even the proverb that says that your gift will bring you before kings.
True.
That's some of the principle of what you're talking about, and being able to walk, listening to God, because God's the best creator. I mean, He is the creator. So all creativity comes from God. And when you're stuck, look up, because there's a creator that has a creative idea. And that creativity, I mean, if you're going to be in the creative world today, you need to learn how to listen to Jesus.
That's true. Absolutely.
In the midst of your daily life, because He's going to be more creative than you are.
Fantastic. That's really good. Really good.
As we close today's interview, I want to encourage you to move forward and do what you're called to do. If you're creative, then you're called to create. Maybe it's a podcast. Maybe it has to do with writing that book that you know He's calling you to write. Maybe it has to do with speaking, or maybe it just simply has to do with worshiping Him every day and showing up and being a messenger of love every single day. Just know that as you listen and obey and activate your faith, then what you bring to the table, He's going to multiply it in such a way that it's going to impact